King Edward VIII is still the only king in British history that chose to give up the crown, country, and birthright. He was the king of the British Commonwealth, head of the Church of England, and the Emperor of India and other colonies from January 20th, 1936 to December 11th, 1936. This time period was just before World War II and Hitler was on the rise in Nazi Germany. King Edward VIII reigned for only 325 days and he was never officially crowned. This makes him the shortest ruling monarch in the history of the British Commonwealth. In my documentary called Abdicating the Throne, the main issue surrounding his abdication is revealed. Throughout history, it is perceived that he chose to abdicate his throne because of his desire to marry Wallis Simpson. The government officials and the press heavily protested this marriage by stating that the British public would never accept a queen who was known to have two living ex-husbands. So King Edward opted to abdicate his throne because of heavy pressure from government and the press. However, historians and the documentary indicate that King Edward VIII was pressured into abdicating the throne not only because of his unpopular fiancée, but also because King Edward sympathized with Nazi Germany's socialist ideology and it was seen as a threat by the British government when the country was preparing for war against Nazi Germany. On top of that, King Edward's unpatriotic actions after his abdication were not supportive. According to the documentary, one of the main reasons that he was forced to abdicate his throne was indeed because King Edward wanted to marry a twice-divorced woman, Wallis Simpson. Mrs. Simpson was not only divorced, but she was not even divorced 6 months when King Edward and Mrs. Simpson was engaged. She was in the process of finalizing her divorce. According to one of my sources, Stanley Baldwin, the conservative Prime Minister of the national government, and his cabinet firmly believed that Mrs. Simpson could not be allowed to become queen. He believed that the public would not tolerate having a woman with two living ex-husbands on the throne. The government also decided that it would be legally impossible for her to marry the king morganatically, which means without becoming queen. Since Edward VIII was king, he was also the de facto head of the Church of England. Because he was the head of the church, the religious leaders heavily pressured Edward to not go through with the wedding. According to the documentary, it would be seen immoral in the eyes of the church for the King Edward to marry Mrs. Simpson. The press was also very harsh when covering the issue. Some of the reports from my research shows that the journalists and newspapers antagonized Mrs. Simpson heavily and sometimes even unfairly. Mrs. Simpson was living in London, England at the time when the situation was escalating into a serious issue in Britain. The documentary indicates that some people even threw stones at her house during her stay. Journalists would wait outside her room and follow her when she went out anywhere. King Edward was out of other options. Edward VIII, faced with the choice of either remaining king or giving up the throne and marrying Mrs. Simpson, came to a clear decision. He would abdicate. Even though Edward VIII was king according to the British Constitution, it is the Prime Minister and Parliament who actually ruled Britain. One of the sources indicates that the king had a dangerous fondness to Nazi ideology and political views. One historian in the documentary states that King Edward VIII's pro-German views were important in terms of him being forced to abdicate by the end of 1936. Even though Edward's desire to marry Mrs. Simpson was the main reason for him to abdicate, the documentary states that declassified FBI files indicates that Edward's sympathy to Nazi ideology was another important reason for the government to oust him from the throne. The king was very open with his appreciation for Hitler. This was a dangerous time for the British government because war between Britain and Germany seemed very likely. The establishment thought that King Edward would be a liability if he was king and war broke out between Germany and Britain. The government and the Prime Minister preferred his brother George VI because he was a safer choice. George VI, who is the father of today's Queen Elizabeth II, was a safe bet for the government and security of Britain. Many of King Edward's actions after abdication show that he indeed would have been a liability. After abdication, King Edward VIII was known as the Duke of Windsor and his wife was known as the Duchess. In October 1937, the Duke and Duchess visited Nazi Germany against the advice of the British government and met Adolf Hitler at his Ober-Salzburg retreat. King Edward had publicly indicated that he was for appeasement at all costs with Adolf Hitler and Germany instead of risking war. The British government understandably did not like this view. The documentary suggests that Hitler was prepared to reinstate Edward as king in the hope of establishing a fascist Britain. It is widely believed by historians that the Duke and Duchess sympathized with fascism before and during the Second World War and were moved to the Bahamas to minimize their opportunities to act on those feelings. The Duke was also accused of giving the Nazis confidential information. According to declassified files, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered covert surveillance of Edward VIII. So the British and American government thought that it would be best if they could take care of a liability because of the imminent war that was going to come with Nazi Germany. Edward VIII, throughout his early life, was a patriarchal figure who undeniably fought for the British government during World War I. However, at the eve of World War II, he became a liability for the British government. This is because his pro-Nazi ideology was seen as threatening to the establishment which was planning for the imminent war against Nazi Germany. On top of that, the majority of the British public hated the idea of the king abdicating because they thought that he should not put a divorced, middle-aged American woman before his duty to his country and people. His desire to marry a divorced woman and his political views were too much for the government. They were not going to allow Edward VIII to compromise and remain king. Because of pressure from the government, he abdicated his throne and married the woman he chose. The British government had to do what was necessary in order to protect the future of the country from the deadly threat of Nazi Germany.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. That I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love.